Welcome to SWK 700, Human Behavior and the Social Environment. This is week 13, and the topic is ego psychology. The material on the screencast is taken from the assigned readings. Take a moment and look at the cartoon on this slide. Think about the many ways that we think about the ego through our contemporary lens. The beginnings of ego psychology emerged in the 1930s, and this was a response to Freudian's structure of the mind, which placed an emphasis on the unconscious, otherwise known as the id. And we did have some material on ego psychologist Erik Erikson. If you remember, his stages of development are based on an ego psychology framework, where the self develops through interaction with the environment and the relationships in the physical environment. So ego psychology's theoretical framework is related to the need for a psychology of normative development. So there is not an emphasis on psychopathology. Rather, the humanistic ideas of the individual's ability to adapt, to thrive, to grow, and to develop talents and capacities and strengths is the emphasis in ego psychology. So from the perspective of this theory, the ego develops as a result of having the basic needs met. Think of the first stage of trust versus mistrust in Erikson's development through the lifespan model. The ego develops through relationship and identification with relationships and others who are close, especially caregivers. The ego also develops through learning from other people. We talked about social learning. There are also psychological theories of learning, which are more cognitive development based. The ego develops through the mastery of the developmental tasks that Erik Erikson identified. If you remember, he identified a conflict at each stage of development, which must be resolved in order for the individual to keep growing and thriving. The ego develops through problem solving and through successful coping and adaptation in the environment. So ego psychology is very much about the person in the environment. The ego develops capacities, skills, talents, abilities in order to function in the world. And the capacities that the ego develops are known as ego functions. And we're going to be talking about these later on in the screencast. But ego functions enable the individual to function in the world in a coherent, organized, successful manner. So a little bit more description on this theory. So it is a theory that extends over the life cycle. So it's also a theory of development. It identifies the human capacity to adapt, function, and cope in their physical and social environments. So it looks at the person and environment in a holistic way. And the idea is that human beings are geared towards greater and more complex and goal-directed patterns of organization as the way of successfully functioning in our environments. So ego psychology is a psychosocial theory. It's useful for us as clinical social workers as a framework for helping our clients to improve their psychosocial development, meaning both their psychological attitudes, perceptions, and abilities, as well as their social relationships, and social skills in the environment. So we look at our clients' ability to keep functioning, keep developing, and keep thriving in the environment. It facilitates a better fit between the psychological needs of the individual and the normative expectations of society. So the emphasis is on coping with the expectations of others in our environment and adapting in order to function in the best way possible in the environments in which we find ourselves. This theory focuses attention on the development of the mind and its psychology through interaction with the social and physical world. And the idea of goodness of fit is the idea that the environment can provide supportive and help us to adapt and cope. And sometimes our social environments are not supportive and actually hold us back from being able to develop and take advantage of opportunities in our lives to keep growing and growing towards that idea that we can self-actualize. If you remember the humanistic Maslow's theory, right? So more perspectives on ego psychology. People are born with an ego. It's an innate capacity, a natural capacity to adapt to the environment. And the ego grows and develops throughout the life course. Your ego is your conception of who you are. From this perspective, your ego is your personality. It's the you that thinks, that feels, and acts in a reasonably consistent manner. And the ego helps you to reflect, to plan, and to behave in ways so that you can fit in more or less adequately with your social environment. So the ego has many conscious functions to help you plan, to help you have goals, to help you make decisions about what is the best course of action, what's the best thing to say, what's the best thing to do in your environment. But there are also unconscious elements of the ego. So the ego is that part of the individual's mind that negotiates between your basic needs and the demands of the environment. So again, it negotiates between our internal needs and the demands of social living. So this idea is based on Freud's idea of the unconscious and the id, right? And the ego moderates or modulates the impulses of the id in order that the individual can fit into society, can function well, and behaves in a manner that is consistent, that is expected in the environment, that is not too aggressive, that is not too unpredictable. So the ego is an important moderator or mediator of our internal impulses and drives and that of the expectations of society, societal norms, cultural norms, expectations, and how we're able to perform in the world is because of the capacities of our ego. So to delve a little deeper into how the ego is conceptualized through this framework, this theory suggests that the ego organizes and manages all of our mental processes and experiences and how we function on a psychological, cognitive level. It stabilizes our mental equilibrium so that we remain consistent. And the ego contains both strengths and weaknesses that reflect how the ego functions are able to help us to adapt and cope. And ego functions, which we're going to talk about in a later slide, are used to manage the tension and the dynamic tension between our internal and external stimuli. In other words, our internal and external experiences, needs, drives, and desires. Over time, the ego organizes its functions into a pattern that is referred to as character structure. So you can think of character structure as our personality. And character structure is the basis for thinking, feeling, and acting in consistent and predictable ways throughout the life cycle. So the idea is that the ego organizes itself, its functions, its abilities, its talents, its capabilities, and forms a character structure that is the core of who we are and the core of our abilities to function in the world. So this idea of a healthy ego is very similar to Erik Erikson's conceptualization of a healthy ego. There are three ideas that go into what is a healthy ego. One is our cognitive capacities, our capacities to think, to make judgments, to make decisions, to plan. Two are goal-directed behaviors. So cognitively, we can identify our goals, we can think about our goals, but we also need to behave and act in ways that we can meet our goals. And then number three is the desire to overcome difficulties. So what is our motivation to keep growing and thriving in our world? So these three things together comprise a healthy ego, which is one that has good cognitive capacities to think and feel, to make plans for one's life, and to act in ways to meet those goals, and to have motivation and desire and encouragement to overcome the barriers and challenges that we may face in working towards our goals. So from a broad perspective, before we get into the specific ego functions, the ego has these broad capacities. Number one, to perceive, filter, and remember vast amounts of information, and to manage both our internal stimuli and the external stimuli that comes to us from the environment. The ego is able to organize information in ways that allows us to think, to feel, and act in a consistent or coherent manner. Number three, the ego needs to find socially acceptable ways of balancing the tension between the id, right? Remember we talked about this in Freudian theory, between the unconscious, deep desires of the id and also the more ideals of the superego. So again, our ego is the executive function that modulates all of our desires, all of our thinking, all of the processes that go on in our emotions and in our mind. Number four, it facilitates the routine activities of daily life, learning, loving, working, playing, etc. And the ego also has the capacity to master developmental and social challenges, to manage all of the experiences and events that happen to us. Mastery also means acquiring new skills and new learning, new ways of seeing and managing our daily life. Number 6, the capacity to adapt to stressors. So stress is a given in everyone's daily life, various types of stressors, various degrees of intensity, and the ego helps us to adapt and deal with and cope whatever stressors we experience. And finally, the ego also serves to minimize the disruptions to our overall functioning. This may be problem solving, this may be regulating our emotions, this may be marshaling our cognitive abilities to deal with whatever is happening. So the ego is the focus of ego psychology, and from this perspective, the ego has all the power to help us in living our lives, thriving, growing, and meeting our goals. So now we're beginning to identify and discuss the major ego functions, and we're going to consider some additional information that will be helpful in our work with clients. So the first ego function on this slide is reality testing, and this means the awareness and accurate perception of the external environment. One's internal world and of the differences between our internal world and our physical and social world. So reality testing, is the client oriented to time, place, and person? Is the client making sense? Are they able to think logically? Are they able to communicate clearly and consistently? Or is there evidence of a thought disorder? Maybe hallucinations, audio or visual, or delusion or loose associations. So is the client a reliable reporter about the events of their life and what they've experienced? The second ego function is judgment, the capacity to identify possible courses of action and to anticipate and weigh the consequences of behavior so as to engage in appropriate action. Having good judgment is critical for being able to problem solve effectively. Having good judgment is really important in the decisions that we make, in the relationships that we engage in. So when making decisions, can the client choose among behaviors that are likely to promote good adjustment and movement towards goals? Or is their judgment based on unrealistic expectations? Does the quality of the client's judgment vary in different circumstances, or is it consistent? Does it demonstrate sound thinking skills, or does the client make quick first impressions and quick judgments about what is happening without thinking the circumstances through? The third ego function is that of modulating impulses or impulse control. This is the ability to distinguish between your primary drives or impulses and your secondary, more higher order thinking or planned mental processes. It's the ability to modulate, to delay, to inhibit, or control the expression of impulses and feelings or affect that may not serve the client very well. Can they modulate their experiences of anger or aggression, for example? Does the client control his or her actions in accordance with social norms and expectations? Does the client ever lose control of behavior or emotions to a degree that creates significant problems in social functioning? Is the client internally constrained from action or emotional expression. So impulse control can go both ways. You might be too tightly controlled and inhibited, or you may not be able to control your emotions or actions at all and may have very loose boundaries, or very that result in social interactions that create difficulties or problems for the client, and or other people as well. So the fourth ego function is interpersonal relations. So object relations is the psychoanalytic term for this. Objects actually refer to people. From this perspective, you can think of attachment. It's the ability to manage relationships appropriately toward goal achievement. Goal achievement meaning that you want successful, nurturing, intimate relationships that are based on mutual respect. It's the ability to see other people as unique rather than replications of significant others from our past. So what this is saying is that when we meet people, we can see them for who they are in their uniqueness, in their humanity, in their individuality, rather than seeing them through transferring expectations based on previous relationships or past relationships. So this is about being able to interact with others based again on mutual respect rather than expectations from the past. It's the development of one's internalized sense of self and of others. So interpersonal relations also includes how one sees oneself in relationship with other people. So it's your internal representation of yourself. You can think of attachment's working model of attachment, which gets internalized through those early caregiving experiences. At some point, you need to relate to your intimate relationships and your relationships with others based on who they are and not see them as through the lens of the past. And it's the evolution of the capacity for mature interpersonal relationships where you can get your needs met, you can be supportive, you can help your partner get their needs met without the difficulties you may have experienced in previous relationships, especially relationships from early childhood. So the questions to ask in your assessment of your client is, does your client manage his or her relationships appropriately? Are they able to set boundaries, and are they able to exchange emotions and intimacy that are fulfilling and nurturing? Does the client act as if other people are unique rather than replications of people from the past? In other words, does your client engage in repetitive patterns based on relationships from the past? Does your client manage some types of relationships, such as collegial relationships at work or social relationships, better than others? For example, family or other intimate ties. So you're assessing a range of relationships and not only one type. So the fourth ego function is stimulus regulation, which also connects to self-esteem. So this refers to regulating the amount of stimulation from the external world, as well as internal stimulation, so that you're not underwhelmed or overwhelmed, so that the amount of stimulation you're able to manage and cope with, and you're able to function in your life. So we as humans are responsive to internal and external stimuli, right? We have a lot of sensory motor skills, our eyes, our ears, our taste, touch. All of these are ways that we take in experiences and feelings and sensations from the environment. And each individual has a different threshold for stimulation. Children exposed to excessive environmental or internal stimulation resulting from frustration may become overwhelmed, unable to self-regulate the stimuli. So, example, with sensory deprivation may result in a craving for stimulation, or its opposite, sensory overload, the child may withdraw as a way of coping with too much sensory stimulation. So, is the client able to screen and select external stimuli in order to maintain a focus on what is relevant in their lives? For example, are they able to be consistent, pay attention, and stay focused on the tasks at hand? Or do they become easily overwhelmed and fall apart? Does the client tend to become overwhelmed or underwhelmed? So underwhelmed is where the client may lack motivation, may feel like they're stuck or fixated in a particular point, and not able to take action. And it's opposite, right? When you're overwhelmed, there's too much going on, you can't focus, you're not sure what to do, where to turn. So this also impacts on self-esteem, because being overwhelmed or underwhelmed, both of these result in how does the individual see themselves? Do they see themselves as being able to be in control, to be able to have some mastery in the situation or a sense of agency, or do they become frozen? So stimulus regulation is the ability to manage everything that comes at us on a daily basis. I would say it's the ability to take space when you need to take space, and it's also the ability to act when the situation calls for more action. So another ego function is that of a sense of identity. And sense of identity, very succinctly defined, is a coherent physical and psychological sense of self. It's the ability to be aware of the world and one's connection to it as real, to experience one's own body as intact, to feel a sense of self, and to experience boundaries between oneself and others. I would also suggest that identity is also about being consistent, even though identity continues to develop throughout one's lifespan. There's a core sense of who one is, even though, your likes may change, your preferences may change, you may learn new things, acquire new skills, go new places, but there's still a core sense of who you are that you feel connected to and provides a solid foundation for you in the world. So the questions to ask in assessment: does the client experience dissociation or separateness from oneself? Does the client have a reasonably coherent physical and psychological sense of self? And does the client maintain appropriate psychological boundaries from others? So the sense of self is very internal. I would also want to include in this ego function that identity is also influenced by context, by social context, by relationships, and by culture and race. So having a sense of who one is in one's social context is also very important to assess. Another major ego function is regulation of thought processes. thought processes is our cognitive abilities, our abilities to think. It's the capacity to perceive, to attend to stimuli, to concentrate, anticipate, symbolize, pay attention, focus, remember, and reason in order to undertake appropriate action. It also includes the ability to communicate your thoughts clearly through the use of language, and to be consistent and stay focused instead of going off on tangents or circumstantial type of thinking or tangential thinking. So, is your client's thinking and speaking organized? Are their thoughts logical? Are they oriented to reality rather than fragmented or irrational? Can the client control and direct their thoughts in order to meet their goals? So the maturing of thought process shifts from primary process thinking to secondary process thinking. So primary process, and this definitely comes from psychoanalysis, is characterized by wish-fulfilling fantasies and the need for immediate gratification, irrespective of whether it's appropriate or not. So think of magical thinking, what I wish will happen, what I fantasize that's going to happen, and it's going to happen because I want it to happen. Primary process is associated with childhood cognitive development. However, it's not only about children. Sometimes adults are also stuck in primary process where they're much more concrete. They're not able to appropriately acknowledge and evaluate what's going on around them, but rather they see things through their own lens. So sometimes they're not able to take the perspective of other people, for example, and may not have empathy or be able to think about how other people may be feeling. So that's all part of primary process. In contrast, secondary process is characterized by the ability to postpone instinctual gratification until reality conditions are appropriate. It replaces wish fulfillment with action. It's associated with higher levels of cognitive development, with the ability to think things through, to delay gratification, to think about consequences, and to deal with the reality of what is happening around the individual. So, whether your client is mature and their thought process reflects the ability to see things in multiple perspectives is what you want to assess. Or are they stuck in their own thinking about what they want and not take into account how their actions may be seen by others, how their thinking may not take into account other perspectives, and is their behavior rooted in their own desire for gratification? So the ego functions manage the drives. And if you remember, the drives emerge from our unconscious id, and they're geared towards pleasure and towards instant gratification. So can the ego appropriately deal with the drive towards pleasure and the drive towards aggression? Can they manage their own well-being in the face of strong emotions and intensity? And the idea is that the ego functions through mastery and competence. So the ego has the potential, the ability to influence one's own environment and one's feeling about their own sense of ability. You can think of this in several different ways. One is you can think about it as a sense of agency, the ability to make your own decisions, the ability to think things through, the ability to have a sense of feeling like you can influence or control what happens to you in your life, and that you're competent to deal with the challenges that you may encounter and use your problem solving skills, use your communication, use your ability to use your judgment and negotiate. All of these are examples of a sense of mastery and competence, that you're able to function well in your environment, you're able to adapt and cope with stress. So mastery and competence are also ego functions. And that the ego is also geared towards seeking relationships. And that idea comes directly from attachment theory and object relations, that we're not meant to be isolated all by ourselves, fulfilling each and every need that we may have, but rather that we thrive when we're with others who understand us, with that we're able to understand others and have a mutual give and take of support, affection, nurturing. So relationship seeking orientation is also seen as part of a healthy ego. And by the way, relationships mean a lot of different things, right? It's not necessarily an intimate relationship. It's also about having gratifying friendships, about nurturing children or nurturing those you're close with, even though it may not be an intimate relationship. So it's about having people in your life that are important to you and that you are important to them. So part of understanding ego psychology is also having a sense of familiarity with the autonomous functions. So the ego functions have been identified, and the ego functions are affected by many different things in the environment, internal and external stimuli, events, experiences, other people. But we also have autonomous functioning that is part of our ego. And these functions are natural, they're inborn genetic capacities. And this is important now. These operate outside of intrapsychic conflict. And this, again, is an idea from psychoanalysis. If you remember, we talked about the role of anxiety. For Freud, every person has anxiety that is part of the mental dynamic or the intrapsychic dynamic that we experience. And the ego manages the conflicts that arise between the unconscious id, right, and then the more idealistic superego. But from ego psychology's perspective, we also have some ego capacities that are free from anxiety. And there are 4 of them. One is our intellectual ability. So it's our ability to learn, it's our ability to use our cognition in ways that are effective. It's also perception, how we perceive the world, how we perceive others. It's our ability to take in information and accurately assess it. Our motor activity, or our physical skills, and then the acquisition of language, which is hardwired in our brain development. So these are autonomous functions that are not touched by the type of mental tension or intrapsychic anxiety that exists in the other ego functions. So I wanted to add this slide and talk a little bit about race and ethnicity and all the ways that as human beings we are diverse and that represent areas of difference in our society that may or may not fit with our social norms, right? So there are 3 circles here. One is the person, and connected to the person is their ego functions, right? Their capacity to cope, adapt, the ability to use mastery and competence. It's the ability to manage oneself in their social environment. For many diverse populations, there are additional areas of development, areas of cognitive development, social relationships, stereotypes, prejudice, microaggressions, racism, and so forth, that also have an impact on the person. So again, here is the person and environment perspective. It's the mind's interaction with the social environment. So we need to account for all of the dimensions of diversity. So we also need in our assessments to take into account social group membership. We need to take into account race and ethnicity. We need to look at all of these through strengths perspective. How does this difference impact one's self-esteem, one's sense of personal power to provide options and choices in one's life? How do you link the client with needed resources, whether they're peer group support, encourage collective and political action? So to look at the socio-political context of environment, in addition to social group membership, race, and ethnicity, we also need to look at gender, economic status or socioeconomic status, socialization, health, vulnerability to trauma, experiences of oppression, culture and acculturation, in other words, relationship with the dominant culture, and experiences of stigma. So all of these, if I were to do this image over, I would actually put arrows coming from the socio-political context to the person and their ego functions. And the arrows would be bidirectional to show the interaction and the spheres of influence on our development and our adaptive and coping capacities. And the final slide that I want to talk about today is a slide on intervention strategies. So we've been looking at ego functions. We've been talking about the ego functions and identifying a little bit of what's important to assess when you're working with clients. So from an ego psych perspective, there are two types of interventions. One is ego sustaining techniques, and that's where you assess which ego functions are strong, which are working well, which can you continue to build on in order to improve your client's psychosocial functioning. So ego sustaining is you want to keep those functions that are working well. You want to continue to explore and describe them. Give your client space and time to talk about them or vent if needed. You want to have your client reflect on their experience in their social environment and in their relationships. And as the worker, you want to have influence on working with helping the client to recognize their strengths and building on their strengths in order to help them better meet the challenges, in order to help them problem solve, make needed changes or wanted changes in their life. And then the second technique is ego modification. So when you think of modification, you think about changing or revising. So which of the ego functions are weak? Which need to be strengthened or changed? Where can you identify strategies so that your client can better adapt, better cope, and better function. So you want to use reflection, you want to use insight, you want to help your client identify their thinking or behavior patterns that may be causing difficulties in their lives. So these are 2 intervention strategies. I'm going to end this screencast here. The next week, week 14, we're going to talk about ego defenses, which is the other part. They're also an ego function, but they're directly related to the intrapsychic difficulties, challenges, and tensions that arise as part of our everyday function, as part of our relationships, our experiences in the world, and the ways that our mind defends itself against feeling the anxiety that comes with certain experiences. So I am going to end this here. I'm going to thank you for listening this far. And in class, we will think about applying the ego functions in order to better understand how these operate. Thank you.